This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. What I'm looking at today is the first season of Netflix's Locke Key. Locke Key has had an interesting path to the small screen in that it began life it started as a series of graphic novels written by Joe Hill and drawn by Gabriel Rodriguez. From there, it was adapted to a television show on Amazon. It actually was stopped at Amazon. And keep in mind something, though. It actually had a cast. It had producers. And I think they even shot a pilot for this series. But for whatever reason, Amazon abandoned it, and it was picked up by Netflix. Netflix recast, reshot, new producers. They redid the entire thing, and that resulted in the series that I'm talking about today. Locke Key, particularly the visual design, as in the design of the keys themselves, the mansion, the Locke Mansion, where some action takes place, looks heavily influenced by the art of Edward Gorey, who lived from 1925 to 2000. If you've seen things like The Addams Family, the opening to Poirot on PBS, Gorey's art is very whimsical, but also very dark, somewhat creepy, well suited to material like this. I mentioned earlier that Locke Key was written by Joe Hill, who happens also to be the son of Stephen King. And this is interesting. There are numerous connections between Locke Key and Stephen King beyond the fact that his son wrote this. One of the stars of Locke Key is Jackson Robert Scott, who also starred in The Prodigy, and he's really good in that. You should check that out. But he also starred in It. So he's starring as Bodie Locke in this movie, and he is such a great actor. Another interesting thing is that Locke Key is thematically very similar to Stephen King's It, in the sense that people, in this case it's a bloodline, they return to a town where something terrible has happened, and they have to go about trying to fix events whose genesis began in the distant past. So it feels like It. Oddly enough, this is not a connection to Stephen King. It also feels like Justice League, the recent Justice League, in a sense that you have people searching for various MacGuffins. In the Justice League, it was a mother box. Here, it's keys. It plays very similar. Oh, by the way, I mentioned Joe Hill earlier. Look for his cameo. He has a cameo the next to last episode. I always find those things interesting. Oh, and also, the last two episodes of Locke Key were directed by the great Vincenzo Natali. Vincenzo Natali directed In the Tall Grass, also on Netflix, based upon a story by Joe Hill. Connections abound. It's fascinating stuff. As I mentioned, Locke Key is pretty good for the most part, though it's not as good as it could be. And part of the reason, at least for me, is that I think that there are some decisions that weren't made that would have improved it, such as the Locke Mansion was such a minor character in this story. It seems a no-brainer that the story would revolve around the house, being Locke and Key. It kind of just makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't. So the house is actually peripheral to the action. Things happen in the house, but the house isn't really well defined as a structure. So it's not like, for instance, The Haunting of Hill House, where that house is the star. The house is a character in that series in and of itself, and it becomes a part of events. In Locke Key, the house is secondary, and in fact, I would argue any large structure you can replace that house with in Locke Key, and it wouldn't really make a difference. It could be an apartment building, for Christ's sakes, and you're entering individual apartments, and you go to different places. It's just not really crucial, as far as the narrative is built, to have that house. And that's a pity, because the production design on Locke Key is really good, And it's such a grand, imposing structure that it would have played a more crucial role to events would have been really neat. And I'm also not quite sure what type of series Locke and Key is trying to be. I would have assumed, based upon the pedigree of Joe Hill, that it's a horror series, but it's really not. There are horror elements to it, to be sure, but it's more of a fantasy series. Something like Harry Potter feels closer to what Locke and Key is than, let's say, The Strain or something of that nature. And that's fine, though I wish it were more one way or the other. Now keep in mind, I haven't read the graphic novels by Joe Hill that Locke and Key is based on, but I cannot help, and I don't tend to do this, but I couldn't help but know where the story was going about 6 episodes in. You could see where it was going, and it was very obvious. And I don't tend to like that type of thing. It doesn't make it bad, but I tend to watch movies by letting myself go with the narrative, and I don't try to anticipate it. But conversely, when I can tell where it's going, I tend not to enjoy that much. But those are kind of minor nitpicks. On the whole, Locke and Key is pretty good, and you will enjoy it. I don't mean to denigrate it. On the whole, it is pretty interesting. This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. Peace.